Good evening and welcome back. Settle in wherever you are. Let the day you have had go quiet behind you. The lists, the small worries, the noise of the hour. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest. And if you are ready, we are going to go somewhere very old and very slow and stay there a long while. We are going to a village. It has no name that anyone wrote down, and that is fitting because there were 10,000 like it, scattered across the low green country of medieval England. A huddle of houses in a fold of the land, a church tower, a mill by the stream, and all around it the great open fields, striped like a ploughed sea. You will not find it on a map, but you can find it in your mind's eye, easily enough, if you let the centuries fall away. A cluster of low roofs under a grey sky, smoke leaning from the thatch, and beyond the last hedge, the fields lying still and cold under the shortest days of the year. For that is where we begin, not in the green of spring, not in the gold of harvest, but here in the dead season, in the deep of winter, when the year is at its stillest, and the whole village has drawn in on itself like a hand closing against the cold. Let us go in among them. It is late December and the light is a thin, grudging thing. The sun, when it shows at all, rolls low along the southern hedges and is gone again by the middle of the afternoon, and the nights are enormous. 16 hours of darkness, and only the fire and the rushlight against them. There is frost on the inside of the shutters. There is ice, some mornings, on the water in the pail, and the cold does not come and go, the way we think of cold now, something to step out of and back into. It is simply there, in the walls, in the earth floor, in the blankets, a constant patient presence that you learn, over a lifetime, to live inside. The village is quiet in a way that is hard to imagine now. There is no work in the fields, the ground is iron hard, and there is nothing growing and nothing to be done to the frozen furrows but leave them be. The great engine of the farming year has stopped turning, and so the days shrink down to the small indoor things, the tending of the fire, the feeding of the beasts, the mending of what broke in the busy months, and the long, patient business of making the food last. Because that is the whole quiet argument of winter in a medieval village. Not cold. Cold you can survive if you have wood and wool and a roof. The real question, the one that sits under everything, is simpler and harder than that. Will the food last? They laid it in through the autumn. The grain in the barn, the dried peas and beans, the salted meat, the cheese, the ale, and now, from Michaelmas onward, they are living out of the store. Every day they eat is a day taken from the pile. And the pile has to reach, not just to the new year, not just to the end of winter, but all the way through to the following summer, when the first new food comes in. There is a stretch of the year, late in the spring, that they have a name for. They call it the hungry gap. It is still months away. But everything they do now, all through the dark of the year, is done with one eye on that gap, and on whether the store will carry them across it. So they are careful. They are very, very careful. Come inside one of the houses, the tenant's house. The family will follow all through this year. There is a father, whom we will call John, though the name hardly matters. A wife, Alice, a handful of children, and an old grandmother by the fire who has seen more winters than anyone can count and is treated in consequence with a wary respect. The house is one long room, low and dim, with a hearth in the middle of the floor and no chimney. The smoke finds its own way out through the thatch and hangs in a blue layer under the roof, and you learn to live below it. There is a partition at one end, and behind that partition, sharing the warmth, are the animals. We will come back to the animals. On the fire there is a pot. There is nearly always a pot, and in the pot is pottage. And if you want to understand how a medieval peasant actually ate day in and day out, you must understand the pot, because the pot was most of it. Pottage was a thick, slow-cooked stew of whatever the household had. Grain mostly, barley or oats or rye, the bread grains and the poorer grains, softened down for hours over the fire. And with it, dried peas and beans, the peas that gave us peas pudding, hot and cold and 9 days old, and a handful of the vegetables they grew in the little plot beside the house, the ones we would barely recognise as vegetables. Cabbages and leeks and onions, coleworts, the green tops of things, herbs from the garden, not for flavour so much as for bulk and for health. And if it was a good day, a little of the salt bacon cut fine, more for the taste of it than for the meat. That was dinner. That was more or less every dinner. The pot went on in the morning and simmered all the short day, and you ate from it, and what you did not eat you left, and more was added, and it went on again the next day. A rolling, endless pottage that never quite emptied and never quite ran the same twice. It sounds meagre to us. It was meagre, but it was also, in its way, clever. A slow, patient way of turning the cheapest food in the world into something hot and filling, a way of stretching a little grain across a long cold day. And bread, of course, coarse dark bread, brown and heavy, baked from the household's own grain, rye and barley more than wheat, because wheat was the fine grain, the grain you sold or paid your rent in, not the grain you ate yourself most days. The white loaf was the Lord's bread, the priest's bread. The peasant's bread was dark and dense and full of the whole grain, and it kept and it filled you, and you were grateful for it. There is a whole world in the difference between the white loaf and the brown, and we will come back to that world too, when the harvest comes, and to drink ale, not water if it could be helped. The water was not always to be trusted, and everyone knew it, though they could not have told you why. Ale was safe because it was boiled in the making, and it was food as much as drink, thick, cloudy, low and sweet, brewed in the house or bought from the alewife down the lane, and drunk by everyone, the children too, watered down. A medieval villager might drink a great deal of ale in a day and think nothing of it. It was simply what you drank. That is the winter table. Grain and peas and greens, dark bread, salt bacon on a good day, and ale to wash it down. It is not a feast, but no one at that table is starving. Not yet, not in December, with the store still deep. That comes later, if it comes. For now, there is enough, and the fire is warm, and the pot is on. We should speak of the meat, because the meat tells a story about the whole year. Back in November, and we will get there at the far end of this year, in the last movement of our long night. The village killed the beasts it could not feed through the winter. It is the hardest arithmetic of the farming year. Hay is precious, hay is finite, and every animal you keep alive over the winter eats hay that another animal or another spring might need. So in the blood month, as they called it, they chose. This ox, this pig, this old cow that will not see another summer. These die now in the cold when the meat will keep, and the rest are kept alive, lean and hungry on what fodder there is. And the beasts that were killed did not go to waste. Nothing went to waste. The meat was salted, packed down in barrels with fistfuls of precious salt, or hung in the smoke of the fire, dark and hard and lasting. The blood became puddings, the fat was rendered. The bones went into the pot again and again, until they gave up the last of themselves. And that salt meat, hanging in the smoke overhead or packed away in its barrel, is the winter's insurance, a little richness held in reserve against the long cold, doled out sparingly, a slice at a time into the endless pottage. So when you look up in the tenant's house into the blue haze of smoke under the thatch, you may see the winter's larder hanging there, a flitch of bacon, a string of sausages darkening in the reek. That is not decoration, that is survival, kept where the smoke can reach it, high and dry and safe from the rats. And below it, behind the partition, are the living animals, the ones that were kept. And here is a thing that startles us now, and made perfect sense to them. The family and the beasts shared the house. The oxen, the milk cow, perhaps a pig, the few hens, they lived under the same long roof, behind a low wall of wattle at the far end from the fire. Partly this was because the beasts were too precious to leave out in the killing cold. An ox was worth more than almost anything the family owned, the very engine of the ploughing year, and you did not risk it to the frost. And partly, cleverly, it was for the warmth. Animals are warm. A byre full of cattle throws real heat, the slow furnace of their breathing bodies, and on the bitterest nights that borrowed warmth, drifting down the room from the beast's end, was worth more than any amount of firewood. So they slept close, people and animals, under one roof, in the dark, breathing the same smoky air, warming one another through the longest nights. It was not squalor to their minds, it was sense. It was how you survived a winter. And what did they do? Through those enormous evenings, when the dark came down at 4 in the afternoon and the fire was the only light, they worked. But it was slow work, indoor work, the work of the hands rather than the back. The women spun, always endlessly the women spun. The drop spindle turning in the firelight, the wool drawn out, fine and even, hour after hour, into thread. It was the one task that never stopped, that a woman carried with her everywhere, that filled every idle moment, because cloth was made from thread, and thread was made one slow twist at a time. The word for an unmarried woman, spinster, comes from exactly this. The woman at her spinning, the thread growing on the spindle in the light of the fire. And the men mended, a broken tool handle whittled and fitted, a harness stitched, a basket rewoven, the small repairs that the busy seasons had no time for, saved up for the dark of the year when there was nothing else to do. And they told stories. Of course they told stories. The old grandmother by the fire had 100 of them, and the children pressed close to hear, and the shadows leapt on the walls, and outside the wind worked at the thatch. Some of the stories were saints' tales, and some were older than any saint, tales of the things that were said to move in the winter woods, of the wolf at the door, of the dark that came in from the cold country beyond the last field. There were still wolves in medieval England, real ones in the wild places, and there were older wolves in the stories, the ones that were not quite animals, that howled at the edge of the firelight in the imagination of a people who lived very close to the dark. The winter was full of these small, patient fears, told and retold in the long nights, half for the pleasure of the fright, and half because they were, in some way, true. The dark was long, the cold was real, and out beyond the fire, the year was at its most dangerous. The light they worked by was the rushlight, the poor household's candle, a rush stripped and dipped in fat and clamped in an iron holder, burning with a small guttering flame that gave just enough light to see the thread or the stitch and no more. It smelled of mutton fat. It burned quickly, and when it was gone, there was nothing to do but bank the fire and lie down in the dark under the heaped blankets and the borrowed warmth of the beasts, and let the long night pass. But the dead season was not all grim endurance. In the very heart of it, at the darkest point of the whole turning year, the medieval village kept its greatest feast, and it lasted not a day, but 12. The 12 days of Christmas, from the feast of the Nativity itself on the 25th of December, all the way through to the 6th of January, the feast of the Epiphany, the coming of the three kings, were the one great, sanctioned, glorious pause in the labouring year. And the reason they fell here at the dead of winter is the deepest reason of all. There was nothing else to do. The fields were frozen, the work had stopped, and so, precisely when the year was darkest and the store was deepest, the whole community stopped and rested and feasted and made merry against the dark. And this was not an accident, and it was not new. Long before the Christmas story reached these fields, the peoples of the cold north had feasted at midwinter, at the very bottom of the year, kindling fires and killing beasts and drinking deep against the long night. The church did not so much abolish that old midwinter feast as gather it in and give it a new name, and let the two things, the birth of the light of the world and the turning of the sun back toward the spring, become in the villager's mind one single blaze of warmth against the dark. And it was warmth, real warmth, in every sense. The rules of the fast were lifted. Through much of the year, the medieval church asked its people to fast. No meat on Fridays, no meat through the long weeks of Advent leading up to Christmas, the belly disciplined for the good of the soul. But at Christmas the fast broke gloriously, and the salt meat came down from the smoke, and the best of the store was brought out. And for 12 days the village ate as it never ate at any other time of the year. Roast meat, fresh killed goose or fowl, the special breads, and the spiced ales. Whatever richness the household had held in reserve, it spent now in a deliberate blaze of plenty at the very moment the year was poorest. And the Lord fed his people. This is one of the loveliest and most revealing customs of the medieval winter. The Lord of the manor, on certain of the great feast days, opened his hall to his tenants and fed them at his own table. It was not pure charity. Nothing in the manorial world was pure charity. It was part of the great web of obligation that bound lord and tenant together, the giving that answered the labour, the roof over the whole arrangement. But on the day itself, in the smoky hall, with the fire roaring and the ale flowing and the whole village gathered at the long boards, it felt like something warmer than obligation. The reeve was there, the reeve, whom we will come to know well, the villager chosen by his neighbours to run the manor's business, the man in the middle, trusted by the Lord and answerable to his fellows. The miller was there, prosperous and a little resented, as millers always were. The priest was there, and John and Alice and their children, and the old grandmother and all the rest of them, filling the hall with noise and warmth on the shortest, darkest days of the year. There was a bowl that went round at the heart of the Christmas feasting, and it had a name, the wassail bowl. The word is old, older than the feast, from a greeting in the ancient tongue that meant simply, be in health, be whole. Ways hail, good health to you. And the answer was, drink hail, drink and be well. The wassail was the drinking that went with the wishing, a great bowl of spiced ale, or ale mulled with apples and honey, and warmed by the fire, passed hand to hand around the gathering, each drinking the health of all the rest. It was a toast and a blessing, and a way of binding the whole community together in the depth of the year. We are all here, we have all come through so far, and we drink one another's health against the cold to come. And in some places the wassailing went out of doors and out among the trees. In the cider country, the villagers would go out into the orchard on the 12th night with the wassail bowl and pour a libation on the roots of the oldest apple tree, and hang bread soaked in cider in its branches, and make a great noise, banging pots and firing off what they had, to wake the sleeping trees and frighten off whatever ill spirits might blight the coming crop. It is a very old thing to do, older than any church, to go out into the frozen orchard in the dead of winter and beg the trees to bear, to make a bargain with the sleeping earth. But it did not feel pagan to them or contradictory. It was simply what you did at wassail time, to bless the year that was coming. And running all through the 12 days, like a thread of pure mischief, was the spirit of misrule. For these 12 days, and these alone, the ordinary order of things was gently, ceremonially turned upside down. In the great households, they might choose a lord of misrule, often the lowliest servant, a boy or a fool, crowned for the season and given license to command the feast, to order his betters about, to preside over the games and the nonsense. The world was turned on its head for a little while, in a safe and sanctioned way. The low made high, the solemn made silly, the whole rigid order of the medieval world loosened for 12 days at the darkest point of the year, and then at Epiphany quietly set right again. It was a release, it was a way of letting the pressure out, and everyone understood the rules of it, that this was the season of misrule, and that when the 12 days ended, so did the license, and the world went back to being the world. But oh, while it lasted, the games and the dancing, the guisers going house to house in their disguises, the boy bishop, the songs sung round the fire, the ale and the mischief, and the bright unruly warmth of it, all crammed into the 12 darkest days of the year, a great defiant blaze of human company against the enormous quiet of the winter. If you had asked John or Alice what they lived for in the grinding round of the labouring year, they might well have said these 12 days, the one long pause when the work stopped and the hall was warm and the whole village was merry together in the dark. And then it ended. It always ended. Epiphany came, the 6th of January, the 12th night, and the feast broke up, and the wassail bowl was put away, and the Lord of Misrule was uncrowned, and the ordinary world reassembled itself. And the very next Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, was the day the work began again. They called it Plough Monday. It is a small and telling ritual, Plough Monday, and it sits exactly on the hinge, between the rest and the labour. On that Monday, the men of the village would take a plough, one of the great heavy ploughs, decked out for the occasion, and drag it in procession round the parish, from house to house, going to the door and asking for pennies, plough money. And with the plough came the plough lights, and the ploughmen in their finery, and often a sword dance or a bit of folk play. A rough, merry, begging procession that went from door to door collecting coins. Coins that in the old days had kept a light burning before the altar for the guild of ploughmen, and that were, in truth, a last little squeeze of festival before the hard year began. But underneath the fun, Plough Monday said something plain and serious. The holiday is over, the plough goes out again, the land is waiting, and the year has turned, and it is time. In some villages, they would actually run the plough into the ground and cut the first ceremonial furrow. Or, if the frost still held and the ground was iron, they would simply drag it round and put it away again. But the meaning was the same either way. The plough was back in the villagers' hands. The great engine of the farming year was about to start turning once more. And there is a rough edge to Plough Monday in some tellings, a threat behind the begging. If a household gave no penny to the plough, it was said, the ploughman might come in the night and plough up the ground before their door, tear a great furrow across their threshold as a mark of their meanness. Whether they ever really did, it hardly matters. The point was the reminder. The plough is a power in this village. Give it its due. The year has begun, and everyone is bound into it now. There is one more station to reach before the winter movement can rest, and it is the one where the whole quiet dread of the season comes at last into the open. Candlemas, the 2nd of February, 40 days after Christmas, the feast of the purification of the Virgin, the day the candles were blessed, a great procession of light carried through the church in the dead heart of winter, every household bringing its candle to be hallowed, the whole dim building filled with small flames against the dark. It is a beautiful feast, Candlemas, a feast of light at the very bottom of the year, when the days have just begun to lengthen again, and you can feel, if you know how to feel for it, the faintest first stirring of the returning sun. But in the village, Candlemas was also the day of the reckoning, because Candlemas fell at the exact midpoint of the winter, halfway between the shortest day and the spring. And by Candlemas, you could look into your barn and your hayloft and your salted store and count what was left and do the hard arithmetic. Half the winter was gone. Was half the food gone too, or more than half? Would the hay reach the spring grass, or would it run out with the cattle still in the byre and nothing growing in the fields to feed them? Candlemas was the day you could no longer pretend not to know. There is an old rhyme that catches it exactly. A farmer's proverb, old as the hills, that says a wise householder should have half his fodder and half his corn still in the barn on Candlemas Day. Half. If you had half your hay left at Candlemas, you would likely see the winter out. If you had less, if the beast had eaten faster than you feared, if the winter had been longer or colder than the store allowed, then you were in trouble, real trouble, and you knew it, and there was nothing to be done but eke it out and pray for an early spring. And there is the older, stranger part of Candlemas, the part that has come all the way down to us in the oddest form. It was said that the weather on Candlemas Day foretold the weather to come, that a bright, clear, sunny Candlemas meant more winter yet, a long cold tail to the season, while a grey and lowering Candlemas meant the worst was over and the spring near. If the sun shone at Candlemas, if the animals cast their shadows, then winter would come again with a vengeance. But if the day was dark, take heart, the back of the cold was broken. It is a superstition, and a very old one, and if it sounds familiar, it should, for this is the root, the deep root of the groundhog and his shadow. The whole business carried across an ocean and given to a burrowing animal, but born here in the frozen fields of the medieval winter, in a people watching the sky at the midpoint of the hungry season and trying desperately to read the year ahead. So they carried their candles and they watched the weather and they counted the hay. And whatever the reckoning told them, the year went on. Because after Candlemas, whether the store was deep or thin, whether the winter meant to loose its grip or hold on cruelly to the last, the light was coming back. The days were lengthening, and out in the frozen fields, under the iron ground, the whole waiting year was about to wake. But that is the next movement, for now the fire is low, and the wassail is long drunk, and the village is battened down against the dark. The food counted, the beast warm behind the partition, the salt meat safe in the smoke, and the family close together under the heat blankets in the enormous winter night. Let them sleep. We will wake with them when the ground softens and the plough goes out into the waking field. If you have drifted, let me gather the threads again. Gently, no need to stir. We are in a village, a nameless English village of the Middle Ages, and we are walking through its year, one season at a time. We left it in the dead of winter, the food counted at Candlemas, the beast warm behind the partition, the family close under the blankets in the long dark. And now the wheel has turned a little further. The ice is off the water in the pail. The days have stretched. There is a softness in the ground that was iron a month ago, and a smell in the air that was not there before. The raw, brown, hopeful smell of the earth waking up. It is spring, and spring in a farming village is not a gentle thing. Spring is the hinge of the whole year. The moment a great gamble is laid, the seed committed to the ground, everything that will feed the village next winter staked now, on faith in the cold wet soil. And so the village comes out of its winter stillness into a sudden, urgent, back-breaking rush of work. The plough goes out and the year begins in earnest. To understand the spring, you have to understand the shape of the land. Because the fields around our village did not look like the fields we know. There were no neat square enclosures, no hedge squares, each belonging to one farmer. Instead, spreading out from the village on every side were the great open fields, two of them, or three, vast unfenced expanses of arable land, each one divided not into farms but into strips. This is the open field system, and it is the physical form of the whole medieval village written on the land. Each of the great fields was divided into long, narrow strips. A strip perhaps a few yards wide and a furlong long, a furlong being, quite literally, a furrow long, the distance a team of oxen could pull the plough before they needed a rest. And these strips were shared out among all the households of the village, scattered deliberately, so that no one family held all its land in one place. John held a strip here, and another strip 3 furlongs over, and a third across the field by the brook. good land and poor land, wet and dry, near and far, all mixed together so that the fortune of the soil fell evenly on everyone. It was fair. It was also, from any modern point of view, maddeningly inefficient. A man might spend half his day walking between his own scattered strips. But fairness mattered more than efficiency in a world where a bad strip could mean a hungry winter, and so the land was shared out, strip by strip, in a great patchwork that bound the whole village into one another's fortunes. And because the strips lay open, side by side, with no hedge between, the whole field had to be farmed together. You could not plough your strip in March if your neighbour meant to leave his fallow. You could not graze your beasts on the stubble if his crops still stood. Everything was decided in common. What field would be sown this year and what field left to rest. When the ploughing would begin, when the harvest would be gathered, when the animals would be let onto the stubble. The open field forced the village to act as one body, to agree, to bicker, to compromise, to bind its many small fortunes into a single working whole. It was farming as a community in the most literal sense. You could not step out of it, could not go your own way, because your way lay in strips among your neighbour's ways, and the field was one field, and it rose or fell together. And here is a thing the spring made plain, that lay under the whole open field world. Not every field was sown, for the soil could not give forever without rest. Grain drew the goodness out of the ground, year upon year, and a field cropped without pause grew thin and poor and gave less and less. And the medieval village, without any of the chemistry we would use to explain it, knew this in its bones and had built its whole farming round it. And so the fields were rested in their turn. Where there were 3 great fields, the village worked them on a 3-year round. One field, sown in the autumn, with wheat or rye, the winter corn. One sown in the spring with barley or oats, or the peas and beans, the spring corn. And the third left fallow, ploughed but not sown, left to lie idle for the whole year and recover its strength. And the next year they all moved round. The fallow field was sown, and a cropped field took its turn to rest, and so it went round and round, each field sown, and rested in its 3-year turn. The fallow was not wasted though. The resting field was where the beasts were grazed, turned out onto the idle ground to eat the weeds and the wild grass that came up on it. And as they grazed, they dunged, and their dung went back into the soil. And this was the great secret of keeping the land in heart. The beasts fed on the fallow and manured it as they fed, folding their goodness back into the earth that would feed the village next year. It was a slow, patient, closed circle. The grain feeding the people, the straw and the fallow feeding the beasts manuring the ground growing the grain again, and the whole survival of the village turned on, keeping that circle whole, on never taking so much from the soil that it could not give again. The fallow field, lying idle in the spring sun, dotted with grazing beasts, was not empty ground. It was the soil resting and being fed and gathering its strength for its turn to come. And at the heart of the spring, at the very centre of the whole open field world, was the plough. And the plough was not one man's tool. The plough was the village's greatest machine, and it took a team to work it. The medieval plough, the heavy plough, the great wheel plough that could break the thick clay soils of the English lowlands, was a formidable thing, a wooden frame, an iron share to cut the earth, a coulter like a knife to slice ahead of it, and a mould board to turn the sliced furrow over and lay it aside. It was heavy, and the soil was heavy, and to drag it through the cold spring clay took not one ox and not two, but a full team, 6 oxen or 8, yoked in pairs, straining together down the long furrow, and no single peasant household owned 8 oxen. An ox was a fortune, a whole team was beyond any one family. So the plough team, like the field, was shared. Here was the daily reality of it. John owned 2 oxen perhaps. His neighbour owned 2 more. The cottager down the lane owned 1 and pooled it. And between them, 4 or 5 or 6 households put their beasts together to make up a single plough team. And that team, that shared and precious engine, worked its way round all their strips in turn. It meant cooperation and it meant friction. Whose strip got ploughed first when the weather was uncertain and every dry day counted? Who provided the plough itself and who kept it mended? Whose ox was pulling its weight and whose was sulking in the yoke? The ploughing was a communal effort and a communal argument all at once. The whole village's fortune dragged furrow by furrow across the waking fields, behind a team of beasts that belonged to everyone and no one, and it was skilled work, harder than it looks. The ploughman walked behind, wrestling the great frame to keep the furrow straight and even, while ahead of him a boy, often a child, one of John's own, walked backward before the oxen, goad in hand, calling to them, coaxing them, keeping them straight and moving. Up and down the furlong, all the short spring day, turning the earth over in long dark ribbons, the crows following behind to pick the disturbed soil for worms. It was the fundamental labour of the medieval world, the image that stood in every calendar and every carving for the month of March and for the beginning of the working year. A man, a boy, a team of oxen, and a straight dark furrow opening across the pale spring field. Behind the plough came the harrow, dragging over the turned earth to break the clods and rake the surface smooth. And then, when the field was ploughed and harrowed and ready, came the moment the whole winter had been waiting for, the sowing. There was a beautiful simplicity to how they sowed, and a terrible risk in it too. The sower walked out across the open field with a seed lip, a shallow basket or an apron of cloth slung at his waist, heavy with grain, and he walked at a steady, measured pace, and with each stride he swung his arm and cast a handful of seed out across the ground in a wide arc, broadcasting it, the grain flying from his fingers to fall and scatter across the ploughed earth. Step and cast, step and cast. It was rhythmic, almost a dance, a walking rhythm as old as farming itself, and a good sower could spread the seed evenly across a whole field by the sheer trained rhythm of his stride and his arm. It was skilled work, more skilled than it looked, sow too thin, and the field came up patchy and weedy, sow too thick, and the seed was wasted, and the plants choked one another as they grew. And so the sowing was given to a steady, experienced hand, an older man who had cast the seed 100 springs and knew by feel exactly how much to let fly with each swing of the arm. The whole year hung on his judgment in those few days, and he knew it, and he walked the field with the slow gravity of a man carrying the village's fortune in a basket at his waist. But think what it meant to do it. That grain in the seedlip was food, precious food, some of the very grain they might have eaten in the hungry months to come. And here they were, flinging it out onto the open ground, giving it back to the earth on the bare gamble that it would return manifold in the autumn. Every handful cast was a handful not eaten, a bet placed on the year ahead. And not all of it even reached the soil. Some fell on the path and was lost. Some fell where the birds could reach it, and the birds knew it and came in their crowds. The magpies and the crows and the rooks descended on the newly sown fields, following the sower, snatching the seed almost as it fell, and so against them the children. This was the children's war, all through the sowing season and after, the little ones sent out to the fields with slings and clappers and their own shrill voices, to run at the crows, to fling stones, to keep the birds off the buried seed. It was a real task and a real anxiety. A field stripped by rooks was a harvest lost before it began. And so the small children of the village spent the long spring days out among the strips, shouting and slinging and chasing the blackbirds off the precious ground. It was the first work a child did, this bird scaring, before they were strong enough for anything else. And it was not play, though there was play in it. It was the defence of the year's whole gamble, entrusted to the youngest hands in the village. While the fields were being sown, another kind of new life was coming. In the fold, in the byre, in the dark of the spring nights. For spring is the birthing season, and the village's animals drop their young now, in the cold and the wet, and the tending of them was one of the great anxious labours of the season. Lambing came first and hardest. The ewes, heavy through the last of the winter, gave birth in the cold nights of early spring, and a lamb born into a frost could die at an hour if no one was there. So the shepherd, every village had its shepherd, and it was a lonely, watchful trade, kept his nights in the fold through the lambing, wrapped against the cold, a lantern by him, listening. When a ewe laboured, he was there. When a lamb came weak, or a ewe rejected it, he was there, warming the lamb against his own body, coaxing it to suck, sometimes carrying a chilled newborn into the house to thaw by the fire. A good lamb crop was wool and meat, and next year's flock. A bad one, lambs lost to the cold, or the fox or a hard birth, was a lean year coming. And so the shepherd watched night after night in the lambing fold, in the cold spring dark, midwife to the flock. Then came calving, the cows dropping their calves, the milk beginning to flow again after the dry months of winter, and with the milk, the first fresh food of the year, the white meat as they called the dairy things, milk and butter and cheese, coming back to the table after the long salt and grain months. And the bees woke. In their straw skeps at the edge of the garden, the bees that had clustered all winter in a slow humming ball began to stir and venture out to the first flowers. And the beekeeper watched them anxiously, for the honey was the village's only sweetness, and the wax was the church's light. And a hive that came through the winter strong was a small treasure. Everywhere, in the fold and the byre and the skep, life was starting up again, new, fragile, needing to be watched and warmed and kept alive through the raw, uncertain spring. But here is the cruelty of the spring, the thing the calendar of the church laid exactly across the hungriest weeks of the year. For even as the new life came, even as the seed went into the ground, the fast came down. Lent was the great fast of the Christian year, the 40 days before Easter. in memory of the 40 days of Christ in the wilderness, a season of penance and self-denial and the disciplining of the flesh. And the discipline was real. Through the whole of Lent, no meat, no flesh of any warm-blooded beast for 40 days and more. And in the strictest reckoning, no eggs and no dairy either, no butter, no cheese, no milk, the white meats forbidden along with the red. The medieval church took his fast seriously, and Lent emptied the table of nearly everything rich. And here is the terrible timing of it. Lent falls in early spring, in the weeks after the winter store has run low and before the new food of summer has come, the very bottom of the year's larder. The salt meat from the autumn was mostly gone or going. The grain was thinning, and into that lean season the church laid a fast that took away the little richness that remained. It was, in a sense, a fast built on a famine. The church consecrating the hunger that the season was going to impose anyway, turning the empty weeks of early spring into 40 days of holy self-denial. A cynic might say the church simply blessed what could not be helped. But to the villager, the fast gave meaning to the hunger, made a virtue of the lean weeks, offered the growling belly up to God, and held out at the end of it the great reward of Easter. What did they eat through Lent with the meat forbidden? Fish. Fish was the food of the fast, permitted where flesh was not. And so the fish ponds that many manors kept came into their own, and the salt herring that had been laden by the barrel was doled out, and the dried and salted fish, the stockfish hard as a board, that had to be soaked and beaten before it could be cooked at all, salt herring and stockfish, and whatever the pond or the river could give, and the peas and the grain that were left, and the green things beginning to come up in the garden, the first wild greens of the spring, the young nettles and the herbs, gathered from the hedge and the ditch to eke out the fasting table. It was thin fare for the hungriest weeks of the year, but it was Lenten fare, and it was holy, and it ended gloriously at last, at Easter. And Easter, when it came, was the great release of the spring, the fast broken, the risen Lord, the whole village pouring out of the long grey weeks into colour and feasting and joy. The meat came back to the table, the eggs came back, and think what the egg meant at the end of Lent. Through the fast the hens had gone on laying, and the eggs had been forbidden, and so they were saved, hoarded, hard-boiled to keep. And at Easter, with the fast lifted, there was a great glut of eggs, a treasure of them, and they were given as gifts, and painted, and rolled down the hillsides, and eaten with a relish that only 40 eggless days could give. This is where our Easter eggs are born, not as a modern confection, but as the plainest thing in the world, the hen's eggs, forbidden all through Lent, released in a joyful flood at Easter, the first rich food after the fast. And there was dancing, there was always dancing, when the year gave license for it. The village on the green, the pipe and the tabor, the whole community whirling out its winter stiffness into the spring air. Easter was joy, plain joy, the resurrection of the Lord and the resurrection of the year, all bound into one. The meat and the eggs and the dancing and the green world coming up all around them. After the dead season and the lean Lent, it must have felt like coming back to life, which of course is exactly what it was meant to feel like. And there is one more spring ritual we must walk, quite literally walk, because walking was the whole of it, the Rogation Days. In the weeks after Easter, on the Rogation Days, before the Feast of the Ascension, the whole village went out together and walked the boundary of the parish, all of it, the entire perimeter. The whole ring of the parish edge, followed on foot by the priest and the people together, from marker to marker, all the way round and back to where they started. They called it beating the bounds, and it was part prayer and part property and part deep necessity, all wound into one long procession. The prayer was for the crops. Rogation means asking, beseeching, and the great purpose of the walk was to bless the growing fields, to carry the cross and the banners round the parish and pray God's protection over the young grain, the tender green shoots that were the village's whole hope for the year. The priest blessed the fields as they passed and prayed against blight and storm and the failure of the harvest, and the whole community walked his own land, praying over it in the green heart of the spring. But it was also very practically about knowing where the parish ended. In a world with no maps that any villager could read, no fences round the parish, no way to look up a boundary but to remember it, the annual walk was how the community kept its own edges in its own mind. From the great oak to the ford, from the ford to the standing stone, from the stone along the ridge to the corner of the far field. The bounds were a chain of remembered landmarks, and once a year the whole village walked them, so that the whole village knew them. And here is the vivid, half-cruel detail. At the important markers, the boundary stones and old trees, they would sometimes take the young boys of the village and bump them against the stone, or duck them in the boundary stream, or even give them a light beating at the mark, not out of cruelty, but so that they would remember. A boy bumped hard against the parish boundary stone at 10 years old would know exactly where that stone stood at 70 and could swear to it in any dispute. The memory was planted in the body, painfully, deliberately, so that the parish's edges would be carried in living minds down the generations. So the village walked its bounds and blessed its fields and beat the memory of its own shape into its children, all in the green, weeks after Easter. And when the walk was done, the great work of the spring was done too. The fields were ploughed and sown and harrowed and blessed. The lambs were in the fold and the calves in the byre. The seed was in the ground, the whole gamble laid, the whole year staked. And now there was nothing to do but wait and weed and pray. Pray for rain and sun in the right order, for warmth without drought and rain without rot, for the long, slow miracle of the growing grain to come to good. Everything now was out of their hands and in the weathers. The village had done its part. The rest belonged to the sky, and so we leave the spring. The field waking, the seed cast, the young life bleating in the fold, and we go on toward the long light of summer and the sweetest and busiest stretch of all the year. Let me draw the threads together once more, softly, for anyone who has drifted near sleep. We are still in our village, still walking its year. Behind us lies the winter and the waking spring and the great gamble of the sowing. And now the year has climbed to its height. The days are long, enormous now, the light stretching from before 4 in the morning to nearly 10 at night. The sun riding high and the dark shrunk to a brief grey remnant in the middle of the night. The fields that were bare in spring are green and rising. The whole world is growing. It is the sweetest stretch of the year, high summer. And curiously, one of the hungriest. But we will come to that paradox. First, there is the hay. Of all the labours of the medieval year, none was watched more anxiously or worked more furiously than the making of the hay. And to understand why, you must understand a simple iron fact of the farming world. Hay was life. Not a figure of speech. Life, quite literally. For the beasts, and so for everyone. Here is the chain of it. The animals, the oxen that pulled the plough, the cows that gave the milk, the sheep that grew the wool, could feed themselves all summer on the green grass of the pastures. But in winter the grass stopped growing, and the ground froze, and there was nothing green to eat for months. And so the animals had to be fed, through all the long cold, on what had been gathered and dried in the summer. That gathered, dried grass was the hay, and the amount of hay you could make in June was the exact limit on how many animals you could keep alive through the winter. Too little hay, and you had to kill beasts in the autumn that you would have wanted to keep. Enough hay, and the plough team survived to plough again, and the cows to calve again, and the flock to shear again. Hay was winter survival, stored as dry grass. Hay was next year's ploughing, standing green in the meadow. Everything came back to the hay, and the hay could be lost. That was the terror that drove the frenzy. Hay had to be cut when the grass was at its best, and then dried, spread out in the sun, turned and turned again, until the green juice was gone out of it, and it was dry enough to store without rotting, or, worse, without heating in the stack and catching fire from its own damp. And drying took days of good weather, and the summer weather could break at any moment. A thunderstorm sweeping in over the ridge, a week of rain, and the cut hay lying in the field would be soaked and spoiled, blackening and rotting, a winter's worth of fodder ruined in an afternoon. So haymaking was a race against the sky, run flat out, every hand in the village bent to it, working from first light to last while the good weather held, because the good weather might not hold, and the hay was life. It began at dawn in the meadow with the scythe. The mowers went out early, in the cool grey of the summer morning, when the dew was still heavy on the grass, for the wet grass cut cleaner and easier than the dry, and the cool of the morning was kinder to the labour that lay ahead. They spread out across the meadow in a line, the strongest men of the village, and they swung the long scythes in a slow, powerful, endlessly repeated rhythm, the great curved blade sweeping low through the grass, laying it down in a long swathe to the left, then the mower stepping forward and swinging again and again, the cut grass falling in neat rows behind the advancing line. It was one of the most skilled and most punishing labours of the whole year. A scythe is not a simple thing to swing well. The blade must be kept sharp, wetted every few minutes with a stone drawn ringing down its edge, and the swing must come from the whole body, the hips and the back and the shoulders together, in a rhythm that a good mower could hold for hours, and that would break a poor one in an afternoon. Up and down the meadow, the line of mowers, the ring of the whetstones, the long green swathes falling, and the sun climbing, and the day heating, and the race begun. Behind the mowers came the turners, the women and children mostly, working the cut grass. For hay does not dry where it falls. It must be shaken out and spread and turned. So they went along the swathes with rakes and forks, tossing the cut grass, spreading it to the sun and the air, and then coming back hours later to turn it again, bringing the underside up so that it dried evenly all through. Turning and turning all through the hot, long day, the whole village strung out across the meadow in the summer heat. And when the hay was dry enough, judged by feel, by the rustle and the colour of it, by the old knowledge of people who had made hay every summer of their lives, it was raked up into cocks, small neat heaps, and then carted to the stack or built into the great haystack itself, layer on careful layer, and topped and thatched against the rain. And all the while, the eye kept going to the sky, watching the west, watching for the tower of cloud that meant a storm, because the hay was not safe until it was in the stack, and the sky could turn in an hour. There was joy in it too, for all the fear. Haymaking was communal and sociable, and it came in the sweetest weather of the year. The whole village out together in the meadow, the food and their ale carried out to the field, the young people working side by side, the long golden evenings. There are worse things than to labour hard in fine weather among all your neighbours, with the smell of cut grass everywhere, and the certainty that you are doing the most necessary thing in the world. The young courted at the haymaking, working side by side in the long evenings. The old told the weather from the feel of the air. The children rode home atop the loaded hay carts, buried to the shoulders in the sweet dry grass. Hard as it was, the haymaking was, for many, the best time of the year. And running alongside the hay, in the same bright weeks, came the sheep. For high summer was shearing time. The season the wool came off, the wool that was, for a great part of medieval England, the true wealth of the land. First the washing. Before they were shorn, the sheep were driven down to the stream or the pond and washed, driven into the water and swum across, or held and ducked, so that the fleece would be clean when it came off and fetch a better price. It was a rough, wet, noisy business, the whole flock protesting, the men wading in among them, the clean fleece worth the trouble, because a washed fleece sold higher than a dirty one. And then a few days later, when the fleece had dried and the natural grease had risen back into the wool, came the shearing itself. The shearer took the sheep and threw it and held it, often sitting it up between his knees, and with the great iron shears, like enormous scissors, a single piece of sprung metal, he clipped the fleece away, working close to the skin, peeling the whole coat off in one piece if he was skilled, a single heavy blanket of wool. A good shearer could take a fleece off fast and clean, leaving the sheep pink and startled, and half its size, bleating its outrage, released to run back to the flock. And the fleece, that was the treasure, rolled and bound and gathered with all the others. The wool clip of the whole village went to be sold, and the money it fetched was, for many a household and many a manor, the money that paid the rent. For this is a thing that must be understood about medieval England. Wool was the great trade, the golden fleece on which the wealth of the kingdom was built. English wool was famous across Europe, the finest in the world, and it was shipped in vast quantities to the weaving towns of Flanders and Italy, and the money flowed back, and it flowed all the way down to the village, because the village grew the wool. The great flocks on the downs, the wool clip of every manor, the sacks of fleece going down to the ports. This was the engine of the medieval economy, and our little village was one small cog in it. When the shearers worked in the summer heat, they were producing not just clothing but cash, the one great cash crop of the medieval world, the wool that turned into silver that paid the lord and the king and kept the whole system turning. So the shearing mattered hugely, as much as the hay in its way. The hay kept the beasts alive, the wool paid the rent, and both came off in the same bright weeks of high summer. And while the men were at the hay and the shearers at the wool, the women of the village were deep in a labour of their own that reached its height in these same long weeks, the summer dairy. For summer was the season of milk. The cows, calved in the spring, were in full flow now, grazing the rich summer grass and giving milk as they gave at no other time of year. Far more milk than could be drunk fresh before it soured. And so the great work of the dairy was to turn that summer flood of milk into things that would keep, into butter, and above all into cheese. It was the women's craft, and a skilled one, guarded and handed down. Each morning and each evening the cows were milked, and the milk carried to the cool of the dairy, and there it was worked. Some was set in wide shallow pans for the cream to rise, and the cream skimmed and churned, the long arm aching labour of the churn. The dasher plunged up and down, for the better part of an hour, until at last the butter came, the fat gathering into golden lumps in the buttermilk, to be worked and salted and pressed into store. And most of the milk was made into cheese, set with rennet, the curd cut and pressed and salted and set to age, wheel upon wheel of it, ripening on the dairy shelves. For this was how the summer's plenty of milk was carried into the winter, not as milk, which would not keep a day, but as cheese, which would keep for months, hard and salty and lasting, a store of summer richness laid by against the lean cold months to come. The white meats, they called all this, the milk and butter and cheese, the food of the dairy. And in the summer they were abundant, a welcome richness on the table after the salt and grain winter, and a great labour to make and to store, filling the women's long summer days as the hay filled the men's. But it was not all hay and wool. All through the summer, in the growing cornfields, there was another labour, endless and thankless and never quite done. The weeding. The grain was growing now, green and rising in the great open fields, and growing right along with it, choking it, robbing it of light and soil and water, were the weeds. The thistles above all, the thistles that could take a wheat field and turn it to a spiny wilderness if they were let alone. And the charlock and the corncockle and the poppy and a dozen others, all rising in the corn, all needing to be got out. And so, through the long summer days, the villagers went into the standing corn with their weeding hooks, a long forked stick and a small hooked blade. And they hooked out the thistles one by one and pulled the other weeds by hand, working down the strips in the heat, bent over the crop, waging the slow, endless war against the wild green things that wanted the field as much as the wheat did. It was tedious and it was hot and it was never finished. The weeds came again as fast as you pulled them. But it mattered, because a field left to the thistles was a poor harvest, and every ear of grain saved from the weeds was bread in the winter. So they weeded all summer long, the least glamorous and one of the most necessary of all the year's labours. And it fell, much of it, to the women and the older children, working down the strips in the heat while the men were at the hay. The whole village labour divided and doubled through the long days, everyone bent to some task. The men mowing, the women weeding and dairying, the children scaring birds and running errands and carrying the ale out to the field. Not an idle hand anywhere in the long, bright working days of high summer. And then, at the very peak of the year, at the summer solstice, came the strangest and oldest of all the village's festivals, Midsummer and the fires of St. John's Eve. Midsummer Eve, the 23rd of June, the eve of the feast of the birth of John the Baptist. But the fires that burned that night were older than any saint, older than the church itself, going back into the deep pagan past of the northern peoples, back to the ancient worship of the sun at its height. On the shortest night of the year, the villagers built great bonfires on the hilltops and lit them at dusk, and the whole countryside was ringed with fire, blaze answering blaze from hill to hill across the dark. And around the fires they danced and leapt through the flames, young men leaping the bonfire for luck, for courage, for the girl they had their eye on, and drove their cattle between two fires to protect them from disease, and set wheels of burning straw rolling down the hillsides in the dark, blazing images of the sun at its turning. The church looked on all this with a wary and uneasy eye, and did what it always did with the old fires. It did not stamp them out, because it could not, but it renamed them and gave the night to St. John, and blessed what it could not forbid. And so the bonfires burned on, half Christian and half pagan, and wholly the village's own. A great blaze of light and dance and old magic on the shortest night of the year. And on that same night the herbs were gathered, for it was believed that certain plants, picked on Midsummer Eve at the sun's height, held their greatest power. St. John's wort above all, gathered that night and hung over the door to ward off evil, and vervain and mugwort and the rest of the summer simples. At their strongest, it was said, in that one charged night of the turning year. It was a night of magic and mischief and old belief, a night when the veil felt thin, when spirits were said to walk, when a girl might see her future husband if she performed the right small ritual by the fire, when the whole village stayed up through the brief summer dark around the blazing hills. It sat oddly with the church, and comfortably with the people, and it marked the exact top of the year, the sun at its highest, the light at its longest, and though they did not dwell on it, the beginning from that very night of the slow decline back towards the dark. Midsummer was the peak. After midsummer, imperceptibly at first, the days began to shorten again. But no one thought of that, dancing round the fires on the hilltops in the warm short night. They thought only that the year was at its glory, and the light was long, and it was good to be alive. The long light brought other gatherings too, gentler ones. The summer was the season of the church ales, the great parish fundraising feasts, when the church wardens brewed a mighty quantity of ale, and the whole parish came together on the green or in the churchyard to drink it, and the money raised went to the upkeep of the church, the mending of the roof, the wax for the candles. A church ale was a feast and a fair and a fun drive all at once. Food and drink and games and dancing, wrestling matches and contests of strength. The young men showing off, the whole village merry together in the long summer evening, and the church's coffers filled by the pleasure of it. It was a happy way to raise money, and a happy excuse to gather. And the summer was full of such days. And in the summer too sat the manor court. For the village was not only a community of labour, but a community of law. And the law of the village was the manor court, the court of the Lord, where the business and the disputes of the whole community were settled. It met through the year, but the summer, with its long days and its gathered people, was a natural time for it. And here the reeve came into his own, the reeve whom we met at the winter feast, the villager chosen by his fellows to manage the manor and answer to the Lord, the great trusted middleman of the medieval village. At the court, all the small grievances of the year were brought and judged. The man whose beast had strayed onto his neighbour's strip and eaten the growing corn, the one who had not done his share of the ploughing, the disputes over boundaries, over debts, over stray pigs and broken hedges and hasty words, the fines for brewing ale too weak or selling bread too light, the whole slow accumulation of the friction of people living close together, brought before the court and weighed and settled. It was the village governing itself, in a sense. For though the court was the Lord's court and the Lord's steward presided, it was the villagers themselves, the jury of neighbours, who knew the facts and gave the verdicts and set the fines. The law was local and it was known, and it was made of neighbours, judging neighbours by rules that everyone understood. And through it all moved the reeve, keeping the accounts, knowing who owed what work and what rent, standing between the Lord's demands and the villagers' grumbling, the indispensable man in the middle. It was not a comfortable position, trusted by the Lord, resented by the neighbours he had to hold to their duties. But it was the hinge on which the whole manorial machine turned, and a good reeve was worth a great deal to the smooth running of the year. And so we come to the strange paradox we began with. The reason high summer, for all its light and its plenty of work, was one of the hungriest seasons of the year. Look in the barn. It is nearly empty. The grain from last autumn's harvest has been eaten through the winter and the spring, and it is now, in the long summer, at its very lowest. The old harvest almost gone, and the new harvest still standing, green and unripe in the fields, weeks away from the sickle. This is the tail end of the hungry gap, the leanest stretch of the whole year for bread. The granary emptying, the new grain not yet in, the village living on the very last of the old store, and whatever the summer could give, the early vegetables, the first fruits, the dairy, a little fish. There was plenty of light and plenty of work and plenty of green growing hope in the fields. But the belly was tight, for the corn was not yet ripe and would not be for weeks. And so it was a strange season, high summer. The village at its busiest and, in a way, at its happiest, out in the long warm days, making hay and shearing sheep and dancing round the midsummer fires. And all the while the barn nearly bare and the new harvest tantalizingly close and not yet come. The paradox of the year, the light at its longest, the granary at its lowest, the whole village working flat out toward a harvest they could see ripening but not yet touch. They were rich in labour and poor in bread, and they lived in those weeks on hope as much as anything. Hope that stood green and rising in every field, promising everything, delivering nothing yet. It was a hunger with an end in sight, which is a different thing from the winter's blind hunger, You could see the harvest ripening, could count the weeks to it, could measure the tightness of the belly against the fatness of the ear. But it was hunger all the same, and it made the long light of summer a stranger season than its beauty suggested. But it was coming. Day by day, through the long light, the green corn was turning. The ears were filling and beginning to bow. The green was going out of the fields, and the gold was coming in. And every eye in the village turned more and more towards the ripening grain, and the great labour that lay just ahead. The harvest, the climax of the whole year, the weeks on which everything depended. So let the summer stand at its height a moment longer. The fires burning on the hills, the hay in the stack, the wool on its way to market, the corn ripening in the long light. And then let us go on toward the gold, toward the sickle, toward the harvest. Once more gently let me gather where we are. No need to wake fully. We have come with our village all the way from the dead of winter, through the waking spring and the long light of summer. And now we stand at the great climax of the whole year. The green is gone from the fields. The corn stands golden heavy, the ears bowed with grain, whispering in the warm wind. And every soul in the village is turning toward it with a feeling that is half joy and half dread. Because this is the harvest, and the harvest was the one season the whole medieval world was truly about. Everything came down to these few weeks. The whole year's labour, the ploughing and the sowing and the weeding and the praying. All of it had been for this, for the ripe grain now standing in the fields. And it all had to be got in, cut and gathered and stored in a short and desperate window before the weather could turn and ruin it. The harvest was the payoff and the peril, both at once. It was the moment the gamble came home, or didn't. When the corn was ripe, the whole village went to the harvest. Not most of it, all of it. Every able body, from the children to the old, was in the fields from first light, because the work was enormous and the time was short. The ordinary rules of labour were suspended. Even the by-employments stopped. Everyone bent to the single overwhelming task of getting the harvest in. The manorial court had its harvest time rules. No one was to leave the parish and hire himself out elsewhere while the Lord's corn stood uncut, for every hand was needed here. The whole community became, for these weeks, a single harvesting machine, working the fields from dawn to dusk in the heat and the dust and the falling gold. They cut the corn with the sickle. The short curved blade worked close and low, a handful of stalks gathered in one hand and cut with the other, bent double over the crop all the long day. It was slow, careful work and back-breaking. Hour after hour stooped over the sickle in the summer heat. But it saved the grain, for the sickle cut cleanly and shed little, where a faster tool would have shattered the ripe ears and scattered the precious grain on the ground. So they used the sickle, and they bent and they cut, all down the long strips, the standing gold falling before them handful by handful. Behind the reapers came the binders, gathering the cut stalks into sheaves, binding each sheaf with a twist of his own straw, and standing the sheaves up together in stooks, a half dozen leaning together to dry in the sun and shed the rain. And behind the binders, in time, came the carts to carry the dried sheaves home to the barn or the stackyard, where they would be built into great stacks and kept until threshing. Reaping, binding, stooking, carting. The whole sequence running all day, every day, for as long as the corn stood and the weather held. The whole village strung out across the golden fields in the great communal labour of the year. And over it all, watching, counting, stood the Lord's men. For the harvest was the moment the Lord's Jew came home to, and the manor made very sure of getting it. Much of the harvest labour was boon work, the labour that the tenants owed the Lord as part of the price of their land. This was the deep bargain of the manorial world. The tenant held his strips in the open fields, and in return he owed the Lord not only rent but work. So many days of ploughing, so many days of harvest. The boon days when the whole village was required to turn out and bring in the Lord's corn from the Lord's own strips, the demesne, before or alongside their own. And on those boon days, the Lord's bailiff was out in the field, counting the sheaves, driving the pace, making sure the work owed was the work done. There was the bailiff, and there was the reeve, and there was often a special figure for the season. The harvest lord, or the reap reeve, a villager set over the reapers to keep them at it, to set the rhythm, to drive the line of harvesters across the field at the pace the Lord required. And here at the harvest above all, the reeve earned his place. For the reeve was the Lord's chief officer among the villagers, and the harvest was the moment his whole year's work came to its test. It was the reeve who had to see the Lord's domain reaped and gathered and safely stored, the reeve who marshalled the boon workers and knew which tenant owed which days and whether he had done them, the reeve who, when the year was over, would stand before the Lord's steward at the audit and render up the account of the whole manor. So many acres reaped, so many quarters of grain in the barn, so many days of labour owed and rendered, every sheaf and every service reckoned and answered for. It was an extraordinary trust to lay on a villager and an extraordinary burden. The reeve was chosen from among the tenants themselves, often elected by his fellows, chosen precisely because he was one of them, because he knew the land and the men and the true state of every strip and every beast, because he could not be easily fooled by his neighbours as an outsider could. And yet that same knowledge made him the Lord's instrument against those neighbours. The man who held them to their boon days, who counted their sheaves, who could not let a friend offer duty without answering for it at the audit. He walked a hard line all year, and hardest of all at harvest, when the Lord's whole income and his own good name both hung on getting the domain corn safely in. A good reeve was trusted by the Lord and somehow still respected by the village. A bad one was crushed between the two. It was the most thankless office in the medieval countryside and one of the most important, and it fell year after year on the shoulders of an ordinary villager who happened to be shrewd and honest and unlucky enough to be chosen. It was hard, and it was watched, and there was friction in it. The eternal friction of the manorial bargain, the tension between what the Lord claimed and what the tenant thought fair. But there was also, on the boon days, something given back. For the Lord was bound to feed his harvesters, and the boon day meals were a real reward, ale and bread and meat carried out to the field, a harvest feast in the middle of the labour. There were customary boon works remembered fondly for their generous food, and others resented for their meanness. A good lord fed his harvesters well, and it was remembered, and a stingy one was remembered too. So the harvest was labour and obligation, and reward all bound together, the whole web of the manorial world, laid out in a single golden field, the tenant cutting the Lord's corn to pay for his own land, watched by the bailiff, driven by the harvest Lord, and fed at the day's end at the Lord's expense. And when the reapers had passed, and the sheaves were bound and carried, there came into the stubble field another company altogether, the gleaners. Gleaning was the ancient right of the poor, one of the oldest and most tender customs of the whole rural world. After their harvest was cut and gathered, the poorest of the village, the widows, the old, the children, those with little or no land of their own, were allowed into the stubble to gather what the reapers had left, the fallen ears, the dropped grain, the stalks the binders had missed, picked up one by one from the shorn field. It was a hard, slow, humble labour, bent over the stubble from dawn, gathering ear by ear, a whole day's work for a small basket of grain. But it was a right, protected by custom and by conscience, and it could mean the difference between a hungry winter and a bearable one for the poorest families in the parish. There were rules to it, careful rules that the whole community understood. The gleaners could not come into the field until the harvest was fully carried, until the last sheaf was off the ground, for it would not do to let them among the standing crop or the bound sheaves, where they might, by accident or design, take what was not fallen. So the field had to be cleared first, the crop all gathered, and only then were the gleaners let in, sometimes at a signal, a bell rung or a sheaf raised to fall on the stubble together. The whole company of the parish poor moving out across the shorn field in the low autumn light, bent over the ground, gathering the fallen grain, ear by patient ear, into their aprons and baskets. And there was a real anxiety in the timing of it, watched over by the reeve and the manor's custom. The gleaners must not come too soon before the crop was cleared, nor be shut out too long once it was. For gleaning was a right, not a charity, old, protected, part of the deep unwritten law of the village, that the poorest had a claim on the leavings of the land, and a lord or a bailiff who tried to deny it, who drove the widows off the stubble before they had their due, would be long remembered for the meanness of it. And what they gathered was theirs, a widow's winter bread, picked ear by ear from the leavings of the harvest, the community's grain shared at the very bottom with those who had none. It is one of the humane things about the medieval village, this, that the harvest was not only for those who owned the land, but that the poorest had their protected share of the gleanings, the fallen grain, the leavings gathered by hand from the shorn and golden field. But the harvest had a shadow over it, always, the shadow of the sky. For the whole gamble of the year, everything the village had worked toward since the plough first went out in the spring could be lost, even now, even at the very end, to a fortnight of rain. Think of what it meant. The corn stood ripe in the field, or lay cut in the stooks, or waited in the sheaf, and it had to be dried to be saved. Cut corn left wet in the field would sprout, the grain germinating in the ear, or would rot, or would grow the black moulds that could poison a whole store, and so a wet harvest was catastrophe. The ripe corn beaten down by the storms, the stalks soaked and sprouting, the grain spoiling in the very fields where it had ripened so bravely. A dry harvest gathered in under clear skies meant a full barn and a fed winter. A wet one, the rain coming just as the corn ripened and refusing to lift, meant a poor and mouldy harvest, a lean and hungry year. And in the worst cases, when the wet ruined the harvest across whole regions, year upon year, it meant famine, real famine, people dying of hunger in a green and rainy land. This was the terror under the harvest, the reason the work was so desperate and the eye so often on the sky. The village could do everything right, plough well, sow well, weed and pray, and labour through every season, and still lose it all in a wet fortnight at the end, the whole year's gamble drowned in the very last weeks. And there was nothing to be done about it but work fast when the sun shone, and pray hard when it didn't, and hope that this year, this harvest, the rain would hold off until the corn was in. The harvest was the payoff, but it was never certain until it was gathered. The grain not safe until it was dry in the barn. The year not won until the very last sheaf was home. And when it was, when the last field was cut and the last sheaf bound, and the whole harvest was safe in the barn, then came the release, and it was one of the great joys of the entire year. The last sheaf itself was special, wrapped in custom and ceremony. In many places, the very last of the standing corn was cut with a kind of ritual, the reapers throwing their sickles at it together, or the last handful left standing and cut by the youngest or the chosen one. And the last sheaf was carried home in triumph, dressed and decorated, or plaited into the shape that we still know as the corn dolly. For the corn dolly, the little figure woven from the last straws of the harvest, was not a toy but a talisman. It was believed in the old country wisdom that the spirit of the corn, the life of the grain, lived in the field and fled before the reapers as they cut, retreating into the last standing stalks. And so the last sheaf, where the corn spirit had taken its final refuge, was cut with care and carried home and kept safe through the winter, woven into its dolly to hold the life of the grain over the dark months and give it back to the fields in the spring, ploughed in with the first furrow to quicken the new year's corn. It is a beautiful old belief, older than the church, and it clung to the last sheaf all through the medieval centuries. The spirit of the harvest gathered up and kept alive through the winter in a little woven figure of straw. And then the feast, the harvest home, the greatest feast of the working year, the celebration when the whole harvest was safely in. The Lord gave it most often, feeding all his harvesters at a great supper in thanks for the labour that had filled his barns, the meat and the ale and the bread in abundance. The whole village gathered, exhausted and triumphant. The year's great work done and the winter's food secured. There was singing and there was dancing, and there was the deep, bone-tired joy of a people who had brought the harvest home against the weather and the odds. After the desperate weeks of labour, after the fear of the rain, the harvest home was pure release. The barns full, the year won, the whole community feasting together in the golden exhaustion of the completed harvest. It was, for many, the happiest night of the year. But the harvest in the barn was not yet bread, nor even yet grain a man could carry to the mill. It was still locked in the ear, bound in the sheaf, and getting it out was a labour that ran on long after the fields were cleared. Through the autumn and deep into the winter, the slow, steady work of the threshing floor. Threshing was how the grain was beaten free of the straw. On the threshing floor of the barn, a floor of beaten earth or timber, swept hard and clean. The sheaves were laid out, and the threshers set to them with the flail. The flail was a simple, brutal, effective tool. 2 stout sticks joined by a leather hinge, a long handle and a shorter swingle. And the thresher swung it up over his shoulder and brought the swingle down, flat on the spread grain, with a great rhythmic thud, again and again, beating the ears until the grain burst free of the husk and fell to the floor. 2 men often worked a floor together, their flails falling in alternation, a steady double beat, thud, 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 that rang through the barn all the short winter days, the oldest percussion of the farming world. It was hard, jarring, dusty work, the chaff rising in clouds, the arms and shoulders aching with the endless swing, and it went on for weeks, because a whole harvest was a great deal of grain to beat out by hand, sheaf by sheaf, all through the dead of the year. And when the grain was beaten free, it had to be cleaned, winnowed, for mixed in with the good grain on the floor was all the light rubbish of the ear, the chaff, the broken husks, the dust and the straw ends. And to separate them, they used the wind. They took the mingled grain and chaff up in a broad shallow basket, a winnowing fan, and tossed it into the air in the through draught of the open barn doors. And as it fell, the wind caught the light chaff and carried it away, while the heavy grain, the true grain, fell straight back down into the basket. Toss and catch, the golden grain falling clean and the chaff blowing away in a pale cloud on the wind. And at the end of it, at last, the pure grain, cleaned and ready, poured into the sacks and stored or carried down to the mill to be ground into the flour that was, at the very end of the whole long year's labour, bread. From the plough in the spring to the loaf on the winter table, this was the last step of the road, the flail and the fan on the winter threshing floor, beating and cleaning the harvest into grain a family could eat. And close upon the harvest came the great settling day of the whole rural year, Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael, the 29th of September. If Candlemas was the reckoning of the winter, Michaelmas was the reckoning of the year. For Michaelmas was the day the accounts came due. It was the end of the farming year and the beginning of the next. The day the rents were paid, the day the year's dues were settled, the day the reeve rendered up his accounts to the Lord for the whole 12-month of the manor's business. The harvest was in, the grain that paid the rent was now in the barn. And so, at Michaelmas, the tenant brought his rent to the manor, in coin or in kind, and the great annual settling up of the medieval countryside was done. And Michaelmas was the great hiring day too, the day the year's contracts turned over, when servants who had served their year were paid off and free to seek a new place, and the hiring for the coming year was done, the labour of the manor re-engaged for another turn of the seasons. The whole human machinery of the manor reset itself at Michaelmas. Accounts closed, rents paid, servants hired, the reeve perhaps chosen anew for the year to come. And there was a goose on the table, the Michaelmas goose, fattened through the summer on the stubble of the shorn fields, eaten at Michaelmas as the great feast bird of the season. It was traditional to give a goose to the landlord at Michaelmas along with the rent, a fat stubble goose as a sweetener, and to eat goose oneself if one could. A rich autumn bird at the turning of the year, the reward of the harvest, the plenty of the season made flesh on the feast day table. So Michaelmas was accounts and rents, and hiring, and a fat roast goose all together, the practical and the festive bound up in one. The great hinge day of the rural year, when the harvest was reckoned and the debts were paid and the whole village turned, fed and settled toward the coming of the dark. And there was one more figure who prospered at the harvest and was watched with a wary and resentful eye for it, the miller. For all this grain, once threshed and cleaned, had to be ground, and grinding was the miller's monopoly. The Lord's mill stood by the stream, and the whole village was bound to bring its grain there and nowhere else. It was forbidden in many a manner to grind your own corn at home with a hand quern, for the mill was the Lord's, and the milling was the Lord's right, farmed out to the miller who ran it. And the miller took his share of every load. The mulcher, a portion of the flour, kept back as his fee, a scoop from every sack that passed through his hands. It was a good living, milling, the one trade in the village that grew richer as the grain flowed through it. And the miller was, in consequence, the man everyone suspected. Was his measure honest? Did he take only his lawful share, or did his thumb press a little heavy on the scale, his scoop dig a little deep into the sack? There were more jokes and more dark proverbs about the dishonest miller than about any other figure in the medieval village. The miller with the golden thumb, the miller who grew fat on his neighbour's bread. Some of it was surely unfair, some of it surely was not. But fair or not, the miller stood a little apart from the village, even as he stood at the centre of its life. Prosperous, indispensable, resented. The man through whose hands all the year's grain had to pass on its way from the harvest field to the family table. The great work of the year was done now. The one season the whole medieval world had been about. The harvest was gathered and feasted and reckoned. The barns were full, the rents were paid, and ahead lay the shortening days and the turning of the year toward its close, toward the blood month and the slaughter and the remembering of the dead and the long return to the winter dark where we began. So let the harvest rest, gathered and golden and safe. We have one movement left, the closing of the year, and then the wheel comes round to where it started, and the village and you may sleep. For the last time, let me draw the threads together. Softly now, for we are near the end and near sleep. We have walked the whole year with our village, winter, spring, summer, harvest. And now we come to its close. The harvest is in, the barns are full, Michaelmas is past, the rent's paid, the goose eaten, and the year is turning down now into the dark, the day shortening fast, the light failing earlier each afternoon, the cold coming back into the ground and the air. It is November, and November in the old calendars of the north had a hard and honest name. They called it the blood month. It is a grim name, and it names a grim necessity. But there is mercy in it too, and remembrance, and the deep gathering in that closes the whole wheel of the year. Come with the village into the last of it. Before we go among the slaughter, sit a moment with the name of it, because the name carries the whole weight of the season. Blood month. That is what the old northern peoples called November. In the calendars they kept before the church came among them, the month of blood. And it was not a name of cruelty, but a name of necessity, and of a kind of dark thanksgiving. For the killing of the beasts at the turn of the year was among the oldest and most solemn rites the northern world had. In the deep pagan past, it had been a sacrifice, the great autumn slaughter offered to the old gods, the blood of the beasts spilled at the year's turning to buy the favour of the powers that ruled the coming dark. The feasting that followed a sharing of the sacrifice among gods and men. The church came and the old gods went, and the sacrifice became simply the slaughter. But the shape of it remained, and the name remained, and the deep feeling of it remained. That at the closing of the year, when the light failed and the cold came, the beasts were killed, and there was blood, and there was feasting, and there was something grave and necessary and very old in the doing of it. Blood Month. The village would not have known the pagan roots of the name, but they kept the thing the name described, as their fathers had kept it, back and back beyond all remembering. We began all those hours ago in the depth of winter, with the salt meat hanging in the smoke. And I told you we would come at the year's far end to how it got there. This is how. This is where the salt meat is made. The slaughter gathered itself around Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin, the 11th of November. Martin had been a soldier once in the far-off days of Rome, and then a monk, and then a bishop. And the story the village loved best about him was the story of the cloak. How the young soldier, meeting a beggar, shivering half naked in the winter cold at the city gate, had drawn his sword and cut his own warm cloak in two, and given the beggar half, and ridden on in the cold with the other half about his shoulders. It is a good story for the blood month, that a story of mercy in the cold, of the sharing of warmth against the winter, told on the very feast when the village made his own hard provision against the coming cold. And Martinmas had his own small warmth, its own last feast before the Advent fast came down. For at the slaughter there was fresh meat, suddenly in abundance, the parts that would not keep, the offal and the fresh cuts that had to be eaten at once. And so Martinmas itself was a day of eating, a brief plenty in the midst of the grim work. The Martinmas beef and the fresh killed pork on the table before the salt took the rest of it away into the long keeping. And around that feast came the great slaughter of the year, the killing of the beasts that could not be kept through the winter. And it came from the same iron arithmetic we met at the haymaking. There was only so much hay, only so much winter fodder, and it would feed only so many animals through the long cold. Every beast kept alive over the winter ate fodder that might have gone to another, and so, before the winter closed in, the village did the hard sum and chose. This ox is too old to see another spring. It dies now. This pig has been fattened all autumn on the acorns of the pottage, the mast of the oak woods, where the swine were let loose to forage in the fall. It dies now at its fattest, its whole purpose fulfilled. This cow gives little milk and will not thrive on the winter fare. She dies now while the meat can be saved. The beasts that would not earn their winter fodder were killed in the blood month, and only the breeding stock, the plough team, the essential animals were kept alive and lean through to the spring. There is a small cruelty in it we should not look away from. because the village did not look away from it. The animals that were killed had names, some of them, and faces the children knew. The pig that had rooted in the yard all autumn, that the little ones had fed and teased and half made a pet of. The old ox that had pulled the plough for a dozen years and knew its own furrow. The cow that had given the family its milk. They were not sentimental about it. They could not afford to be. And a people who lived as close to their beasts as this one did understood, better than we do, that the animal was food, was always going to be food, was kept alive, precisely so that one day it would feed them. But it was still a hard morning when the beast that had shared the longhouse warmth was led out to the block, and the children were not always spared the sight of it. And there was a gravity in the killing that was more than butchery. This was the beast giving itself up to keep the family alive through the winter. And if the old blood month sacrifice had any true descendant, it was perhaps this, the sober, unsentimental, wholly necessary killing of the animal you had raised, done with care and without waste, in the knowledge that its death was your winter's life. The choosing itself was a reckoning as hard as the Candlemas counting, and it fell largely to John, and to the reeve who knew the manor's whole stock, and to the old wisdom of the grandmother, by the fire who had seen 60 of these autumns, and could look at a beast and know whether it would thrive on winter fare or waste away and die on it before the spring, taking its fodder with it for nothing. Better to kill it now at its fattest and have the meat than to feed it through half the winter and lose it anyway. So they went through the stock, beast by beast, and did the sum. This one lives, this one dies, this one we cannot afford to carry. It was the arithmetic of survival, worked out in flesh and hay, and there was no sentiment in the sum, only the cold, clear knowledge of how much fodder there was, and how many mouths it would carry to the spring. It was a hard thing to do, and it was done with skill and without waste. The killing itself, the butchering, was the work of the season, and from it came the whole winter larder. The meat was salted down, packed in barrels with the precious salt, or hung in the smoke of the fire to cure hard and dark and lasting. The salt meat we found hanging in the tenant's house at the start of our year, the winter's insurance against the hungry dark. And nothing was wasted, nothing at all. The blood was caught and made into puddings, the black puddings of the slaughter season. The fat was rendered down for cooking and for lamps and for 100 uses. The intestines were cleaned and stuffed to make the sausages, the meat minced and spiced and packed into their casings and hung to cure. The trotters and the head and the offal all went into the pot or the preserving barrel. The hide was tanned for leather, the bristles kept, the very bones boiled and boiled for their goodness, and then at last ground or discarded. From nose to tail, the beast was used entirely, transformed in a few days of hard skilled work, from a living animal into the salted, smoked, potted, rendered store that would carry the household through the winter to come. The blood month was butchery, yes, but it was butchery as the deepest kind of providence, the year's living wealth converted at the last possible moment into the food that would keep the village alive through the dark. But the blood month was not only slaughter. At its very beginning, in the first days of November, the village kept one of the most tender and haunting seasons of the whole Christian year, the remembering of the dead, The 1st of November was All Hallows, All Saints, the feast of all the holy dead, all the saints, known and unknown, the whole shining company of heaven honoured together on one day. And the 2nd of November was All Souls. And All Souls was the day of the ordinary dead, the day the whole village remembered its own, the parents and the children, and the neighbours who had died, the whole long roll of the parish dead, going back through the generations, all of them prayed for on this one day. For in the medieval faith, the dead were not gone, not cut off, but waiting in purgatory, the great intermediate place, being cleansed of their sins before they could come at last to heaven. And the prayers of the living could help them, could shorten their waiting, could ease their passage. And so on All Souls, the living prayed for the dead with a special fervour, and the bells were rung through the night, tolling across the dark fields for the souls of the departed, a sound that must have carried something almost unbearable in it, the whole parish's dead called to mind in the tolling of the passing bell through the long November night. And the children went souling. From door to door through the village they went, the poor and the young, singing for soul cakes, small spice cakes baked specially for the season, given out at the door in exchange for a promise to pray for the giver's dead. A soul cake, went the old souling song at the door. Have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. And if you have no soul cakes, then a cup of your best ale will do. And God bless the master of this house, and all the household too. A soul cake for a soul, the old rhyme went. Take one for the dead and say a prayer. And the household gave, gladly, because the prayers of even the poorest child were prayers, and the dead in purgatory needed all the prayers they could get. And so the giving of the soul cakes was a small transaction of mercy running right through the village. Bread for the living, prayers for the dead, the two woven together on the dark days at the turning of the year. It is where our own autumn customs come from, distantly. The going door to door, the small cakes given at the threshold, all of it born here in the medieval village, remembering its dead in the first cold days of November. And on the night itself, the churchyard came alive with small lights, for it was the custom in many places to go out to the graves on All Souls' night, to the low mounds in the churchyard where the parish dead lay all around the church, generation upon generation of them, the whole village's ancestors gathered in the ground within the sound of the same bell, and to kindle candles there, and to kneel and to pray for the souls that lay below. Imagine it, the dark November churchyard, the cold coming down, and scattered across it the small flames of the candles, one at this grave and one at that, each a living hand's memory of a particular dead soul. A wife kneeling at her husband's grave, a son at his mother's, the whole community out among its dead in the dark, the candles guttering in the wind, the bell tolling overhead. It is one of the most moving images the medieval year can give us. The living and the dead brought together for one night by candlelight. The family bond stretched across the grave and held there, warm and small and stubborn against the enormous dark. They believed the dead could feel it, could be helped by it, could be eased in their long waiting by these prayers and these small flames. And whether or not the dead were eased, the living surely were. For grief in that faith was not a helpless thing, but an active one, a thing you could do something about. Kneeling at the grave with a candle and a prayer that you believed with your whole heart reached the beloved dead and did them good. For this was the truth at the heart of the medieval parish. It was a community not only of the living but of the dead. The dead were still members, still remembered, still prayed for, still present in the churchyard where they lay all around the church and in the memory of the whole village that knew every name. The living and the dead were one community, bound across the grave by prayer and remembrance, and never was that bond felt more strongly than at All Souls, when the whole parish turned to remember its own, and the bells rang through the night, and the soul cakes went from door to door in the gathering dark. And then, as November wore on toward its end, and the days shrank toward the shortest, the church's year began again, and it began, as it always did, in fasting and in waiting. Advent. Advent was the season of preparation before Christmas, the 4 weeks of waiting for the coming of the light, and like Lent, a season of fasting and self-denial. The meat that had just been salted down was not to be freely eaten yet. The Advent fast asked the village to hold back, to wait, to prepare its soul for the great feast to come. And there was a fitness in it, a rhythm the whole year had taught them. After the plenty of the harvest and the labour of the slaughter, a pause, a holding of the breath, a fast in the deepening dark before the great blaze of Christmas broke it. The nights were closing in fast now, the light failing, the cold hardening the ground once more, and the village drew in again as it had drawn in at the year's beginning. The work of the fields all done, the harvest stored, the meat salted, the accounts settled, the dead remembered, and nothing left now but to wait out the closing dark toward the feast of the Nativity. There was a rhythm the whole year had built toward this, and the village felt it in the body as much as the mind. All the outward turning labour of the light half of the year, the ploughing that faced the open field, the sowing that scattered the seed abroad, the haymaking and the harvest that carried the village out into the meadows, and the corn from dawn to dark. All of it was over now, folded up and put away, and the year turned inward. The work that remained was the work of the hearth and the close indoors, the tending of the salted store, the mending of the tools that the busy months had worn, the ordering of the barn, the settling of the beasts into their winter stalls. Where the summer had flung the village out across its fields, the winter drew it back into its houses, into the small circle of the firelight, into the long evenings and the close warm dark. It was the same turning we had watched at the year's beginning, only felt now from the other side. Not the reluctant end of the resting season, but the earned beginning of it, the great labour done, the rest deserved and coming. And the fast of Advent gave the closing dark its shape and its discipline. 4 Sundays of waiting, the candles of the season lit one by one against the deepening dark, the promise of the light held out at the far end of the fast. For Advent looked toward Christmas as Lent looked toward Easter, a season of denial pointing at a season of joy. The belly discipline now so that the feast, when it broke, would blaze the brighter, and they knew the feast was coming. However hard the Advent fast, however cold the closing dark, they knew that at the bottom of the year, at the very darkest point, the great 12-day blaze of Christmas waited. The wassail and the misrule, and the Lord's warm hall, the whole bright, defiant human warmth against the dark that we found at the start of our year and will find there again every year, world without end. The fast was bearable because the feast was sure. The dark was bearable because the light was coming. That was the wisdom the whole turning year had taught them, in season after season, that nothing lasted, neither the plenty nor the want, neither the light nor the dark, that everything came round. They spent the shortening days on the indoor work again, the mending and the making by firelight, the same slow patient labour we found them at in the first movement of our long night. The tools were cleaned and hung up, the barn was ordered, the stores checked over, the beasts that had been kept settled into their winter quarters behind the partition. The thatch was mended against the coming storms, the woodpile built high, the whole household made snug and battened down for the winter that was almost upon them. The year's great gamble was over, won or lost, and the village had come through it, the barns full or thin, the store deep or shallow. But the wheel turned once more and the harvest safely passed. And now, in the deepening dark of Advent, there was time again to sit by the fire in the long evenings and spin and mend and tell the old stories and wait for the light to come back. And so we have come all the way round. Do you feel it? We are back where we began. The first snow is falling now, out beyond the last field. The same snow we saw on the winter fields at the very start of our long night together. The village is battened down, the fire lit, the salt meat hanging in the smoke, the beasts warm behind the partition, the store gathered in and counted, the family close together in the low room under the enormous winter dark. And out beyond the mended shutters, the year lies still and cold again, resting, waiting, as it was resting and waiting when we first came among them, all those turns of the season ago. For that is the deepest truth of the medieval year, the thing our village knew in its bones and lived by in every season. The year is a wheel, and the wheel comes round, winter to spring, to summer, to harvest, to the blood month, and back again to winter, round and round, the same great turning, year upon year upon year, the plough always going out again in the spring, the hay always cut in the June meadow, the harvest always got in against the weather, the beasts always slaughtered in the blood month, the dead always remembered as the dark comes down. Nothing began and nothing ended. Everything came round. The child who scared the crows in the spring grew to swing the scythe in the summer, and to walk behind the plough, and at last to sit by the fire, an old woman full of the old stories, while a new child scared the crows in the same spring field. The generations turned like the seasons, and the village went on, and the wheel came round and came round and came round. There is a great peace in that at the end, a great deep restfulness in the turning of the wheel. The medieval village lived close to hunger and close to death, and its year was hard, harder than we can easily imagine, full of labour and fear and the constant reckoning of whether the food would last. But it was also whole, and it was rounded, and it turned with a rhythm as old as farming and as sure as the seasons. The same feasts, the same labours, the same festivals coming round in their appointed times, the whole community bound into the great slow wheel of the year, together, generation after generation. They knew where they were, always in the turning. They knew what the season asked and what the next would bring. And there is a rest in that, a deep belonging that we who have lost the wheel can only imagine. So let the snow fall on the sleeping village as it fell when we came. Let the fire burn low in the low dark room. Let the family draw close under the heaped blankets, the beast breathing warm behind the partition, the salt meat safe in the smoke. The year gathered in and the wheel come round and everything, at last at rest. They have done the whole year's work, they have come through, and now as the village sleeps at the turning of the year, the whole world gathered in and battened down against the winter dark. It is time at last for you to sleep as well. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.